Yeah, so I'm Ben Gordon. I'm the co-owner of Phoenix Spirits. We're a company that revives heritage brands, so brings dead, interesting brands back to life. Actually, I'm not from the spirits world. My kind of industry background is actually in branding and marketing. So up until late last summer, for the prior 15 years before that, I was working for a big marketing group called WPP. They've got a whole bunch of different advertising agencies, brand agencies, PR agencies, and so on. And I was leading one of their brand and design agencies in Asia, so across the region, based out of Hong Kong. So my background's all in brand, advising big kind of corporate brands like Coca-Cola and Samsung and HSBC, brands like that, on how they position themselves, what they, the brand stories they tell, but also how they bring their brands to life visually. So it's quite nice to now be sitting the other side of the table and be owning a brand rather than advising on a brand. Yeah, and so Phoenix Spirits was launched. So Rob, my business partner, and I both kind of gave up the day jobs and started focusing on this full time from late last summer. So early days, but very exciting. So Koosh is an exotic orange bitter liqueur. So it's a 20% ABV bitter liqueur. So all natural botanicals and then steeped, macerated in pure spirit. It's very citrus forward. So we've got a variety of citruses in there, including kumquat, which gives it a really interesting, quite exotic dimension. We've then got that paired with a bunch of exotic botanicals. So quite kind of warming root spices like turmeric, anise, cardamom, black tea. So it's a really interesting, quite distinctive flavor profile. It's all natural colored. So the turmeric, as well as a few other things, helps create a very kind of saffron golden color, which is lovely, but all natural, all vegan product. It's produced entirely in the UK. And with a degree of impartiality, I can say it's absolutely delicious. Koosh is a revived heritage brand. So had its heyday in the kind of late 19th century. So Koosh was established in 1881. So the name itself is Indian, but again, a British brand. So we actually don't know from the records kind of exactly what Koosh means. Was it referring to a particular place, a particular area? We don't know. The word Kush, interestingly, in Hindi, spelt differently, Khush, means happiness. So potentially there was some sort of derivation or kind of play off that, but we don't know for sure. But what we do know is the brand was established in 1881. The business was initially based in Liverpool. So, you think of that period, Liverpool was obviously such an important kind of trading port in Britain. So you've got kind of all these exotic spices and botanicals being brought back from around the world, particularly the Far East. And that's really what informed Koosh. So we sort of like to think about the brand as kind of trying to bottle that sort of exotic spirit, which would have been obviously to an audience back in the 19th century, incredibly kind of new and interesting and exciting and kind of exotic. So that's what we're trying to do with the brand, is kind of recreate that sense of the exotic. And I think, apart from sort of the provenance, I think Koosh is just a brilliant name. I mean, I've spent 15 years advising brands on names. It's always a really hard process. When you do find a good name, it's impossible to register. And nowadays, from a brand perspective, you want something that can work kind of around the world, have a sort of a universal quality to it. And what I love about Koosh is, as a name, it sort of positions the brand in terms of its history, but actually it's also something that kind of anybody from around the world could say. You're standing at a bar in Paris, de couche, s'il vous plaît, it kind of works. Equally, if you're in China, couche, like it just works. It's a brand that you can pretty much any sort of culture around the world, I think, can appropriate it and sort of make it feel natural, which is really hard to come by. So actually one of the first things that sort of, enticed us when we sort of stumbled across Koosh in terms of our research around brands to revive was the name. The archives on Koosh are harder to come by. We know that towards the early part of the 20th century, there was a change of business ownership. So the original founders lost control of the brand and it was taken over by a different business. And then, of course, like so many businesses and companies in the UK, you then have the impact of the two world wars. So what we see is the brand is still around and referenced, for example, in the 1937 Cafe Royale cocktail book. So, well-known cocktail book. So you've got references to the brand still being kind of active in the late 30s. But then from the early 1940s onwards, the business basically goes dormant and doesn't trade from then on. Honestly, it was love at first sight with Koosh. We just loved as I said, the name was one piece, but just visually as well, the brand was incredibly kind of appealing. There are so many elements to it that are quite unique. So the shape of the bottle, the silhouette of the bottle, it's got a very long neck. It's got these lovely Art Deco curves, just very, very distinctive to look at. And the other part is the design. So the sort of main feature of the front label is this lady sitting on top of a tiger in the middle of a jungle. And it's just visually very kind of evocative. Who is this lady? Is she human? Is she a goddess? What on earth is she doing sitting on top of a tiger in the middle of a jungle? It's lovely and kind of enigmatic. And you just sort of I think the brand has a very alluring quality to it, which drew us in. And those are probably the key things that you're sort of looking for in terms of, okay, here's a heritage brand that we want to revive. Do we immediately see the sort of the visual qualities, how we're going to bring it back to life, but also do those visual qualities lend themselves to a brand that's going to work in today's world? Because nowadays brands need to interface across social media in a digital format. So we could see immediately ways that some of the core sort of iconography of the brand would actually lend itself to kind of contemporary sort of ways of communicating for a brand. So yeah, and I think the final piece to say is just again that sort of exotic provenance. We also immediately sort of got a sense of, okay, here's how we would bring the liquid itself back to life, because Koosh in the late 19th century was a cocktail bitter, so more like an Angostura bitter, where you would just put a tincture bitter, so a small amount. It would have been a high ABV product. Nowadays, we've reinvented Koosh as a 20% ABV. So it's something that you can drink by itself on ice or with tonic, as well as being a modifier in a cocktail. Koosh was less well known, and there's less sort of archival material to get your hands on. So we do know, for instance, that one of the original ingredients was something called Quassia amara, which is actually what makes it bitter. That's the bitter agent in Koosh, and so that's a tree bark. It's quite an interesting story that at the time, the Dutch were really monopolizing the kind of supply of cinchona, so which contains quinine, kind of an anti-malarial ingredient. And so Quassia amara was a sort of an alternative that also had anti-malarial properties. And we think that's why it was used in Koosh. So that we always knew was an ingredient that we wanted to retain to create that sort of lineage back to the original. But in terms of the rest of the formula, really, we were actually just more inspired by the brand itself. So, we understood the provenance. That's why we have a lot of Eastern botanicals, the root spices, which you wouldn't typically necessarily kind of associate with a bitter liqueur, certainly not a kind of continental European bitter liqueur. So, I think just really inspired and sort of guided by the brand itself. And that helped us both in terms of the ingredients as well as sort of visually how we brought it back to life.
You got in a creative agency, Stranger and Stranger. So tell us all about that sort of process.
Yeah, so Stranger and Stranger are probably, well, if not then certainly one of the kind of preeminent design agencies in the sort of alcohol spirits world. They've worked on so many iconic brands. I sort of think, in my head, I sort of think of two different sort of forms of creative brief. You've got one where it's kind of a blank page and you're really looking for a full kind of creative concept. And then the other is actually, which is more where we were, is, we were in a position where we had original bottles, we had original advertising material, we had a lot of original artifacts that we were able to give to the Stranger and Stranger team. So it's not as if we were starting from scratch. And I would sort of, I guess, characterize the brief more as one of crafting and refinement, and really creating, we had the bits, the sort of pieces of the jigsaw, and it was a question of how do we bring all this together in the most kind of elegant, compelling way. And that's what Stranger did for us, which was great. And they're really nice agency to work with, in the sense that they have a studio in London, they have a studio in New York, and actually I think wherever you sort of interface with them, and you, so for example, we gave our brief to the London team, but actually we then had a design team working across London and New York, which I think is just nice. It sort of makes it culturally more interesting to work with a variety of people, but also great from a thinking about the future of the brand. Obviously we want to create something that's going to appeal to audiences around the world, so actually really nice to have a global team working on it. Stranger were the ones creating the core visual assets, but then we were then interfacing with, for example, on the bottle right here, the bottle was all manufactured in the UK, so this is all, obviously it's an unusual shape, so this is all bespoke glass, and that was all manufactured by a company called Sturzel, based up in the north of England. So there was Stranger and Stranger doing all of the creative assets, but then interfacing with the bottle manufacturers to create the glass, which is such a obviously sort of important piece of the overall sort of visual aesthetic. The most distinctive features of the bottle are the long neck, the kind of elongated neck, and then these ridges, which are really beautiful. I sort of always think of it, if you invert it, I always think it looks like a beautiful cocktail glass with the stem, if you were to sort of cut off the rest of the bottle there. But that's exactly how the originals looked. So the original bottles tended to be smaller. So we're now, the bottle's a 70 cl bottle, a typical big bottle. But in the 19th century, it would have been a smaller bottle size. And we have those originals, and they're almost exactly the same in terms of the silhouette. We did tweak a few things to make sure that the bottle could work on contemporary bottling lines and that kind of thing. So there were a few sort of practical decisions that we made, but by and large, it's the original sort of silhouette. So it's so important for us. What we always talk about is kind of, it's creating that sort of golden thread, right? The lineage from where we are today back to the original. So if you were someone who'd never heard about Koosh, never seen the brand or encountered it, if I presented you today's bottle and the original, you would very clearly see that those two, were part of the same family, that they'd come from the same place. And that sort of authenticity that gives us in terms of the heritage, I think is really our key differentiator. So that for us is what we're sort of always trying to be laser focused around. Katie was sort of on our wish list even before we briefed Stranger and Stranger. So she's a British-based illustrator. She's probably, I would say, I'm not an expert in this, but I would say she's probably the kind of leading botanical illustrator in the UK. So she'd done some lovely work for Kew Gardens that we saw. So her depictions of flowers and animals are stunning. And so, we knew we had our sort of core icon of the tiger, and then in this jungle scene. So we just thought stylistically she would be kind of perfect. We had no idea whether she would be interested in working with us, but we sort of had her on our wish list. And Katie's done work for the likes of Hermes and Gentle Monster, Korean brands. So she's worked with some big names. And so once we briefed Stranger and Stranger, we did talk about, okay, who might we collaborate with in terms of the kind of central illustration for the front label. And fortunately she was interested in getting involved with the project. I think having the brief come from Stranger and Stranger was very helpful in that respect. That gave us the credibility, and so we love what she's done, and it's such a sort of like central feature of the label now. The other thing is, we wanted, I think Koosh has a sort of a feminine side to it as a brand and as a design. So there was a sort of a number one, the fact that Katie was British was a sort of a draw, in the sense that we were trying to create a very British brand, and almost the entire thing, apart from the closures, the core closures, are from the UK. So we've achieved that, but we also wanted it to have a kind of a feminine authenticity, and so having Katie kind of contribute to the label, I think was sort of helpful in that respect. The kind of key serve that we're pushing and promoting is what we call the Koosh Fizz, which is Koosh and champagne, or Koosh and sparkling wine. And actually, right from the outset, we designed this liquid. In terms of the liquid formulation, we designed this liquid to pair very well with champagne and with sparkling wines. So that was always sort of the intent, rather than kind of, you know, a lucky happenstance. So Koosh Fizz is 1 part Koosh, 1 part champagne or sparkling wine, and because of the sort of the citrus, but also the warmth of the root spices that we have in Koosh, when you pair that with the kind of minerality or sort of chalkiness of a champagne or a sparkling wine, some magic happens, and that is a really lovely combination. And the other thing is it's an incredibly easy serve. So that's sort of part of what we were trying to design here, is something that's very sophisticated in terms of its flavor profile. It looks beautiful because the color, the sort of saffron color of Koosh, then paired with the champagne, creates a beautifully, beautiful looking cocktail. And it just tastes delicious. So Koosh Fizz is the kind of key serve that we're promoting. And then we have two cocktails or two sort of suggested cocktails on the label, and the other is a bitter cup. So as well as pairing well with champagne, I would say in terms of base spirits, Koosh kind of plays well with anything that works with citrus. So gin is a great example. Gin works very well with all types of citrus. And so the bitter cup is a gin cocktail. So it's 2 parts Koosh, 1 part gin, and then 2 parts ginger ale. And that makes it for just a delicious kind of longer serve. You can swap out the ginger ale for tonic. So effectively a kind of a little bit of a sort of upgraded gin and tonic. So Koosh gin and tonic works really, really nicely. So it's a very versatile liquid. Again, we're focusing on the pairing with champagne or sparkling wine, because we think that's a lovely premium serve. And again, one that's very simple to make either at home or in a bar. But actually it's a super versatile liquid. And what we're finding is that in the on-trade, bartenders are getting very creative and using it in all sorts of ways. It pairs well with rum. It can take some heat. So really, really kind of versatile liquid. We're really in the early days. I would sort of classify where we are at the moment as sort of seeding the brand in the UK, because I think of the nature of the liquid as a liqueur, as a kind of modifier. Certainly for us, it's really important that we establish ourselves in the trade first, and help bartenders to A, get to know the brand, and B, get to know sort of how to use it and how to play with it. So our initial focus is going to be very much trade led. Although, mid to long term, absolutely, we want to open up some more retail consumer opportunities for the brand. And we're starting with the UK just because it's such a influential, sort of important spirits market. But a little bit, as I was alluding to, kind of the universality of the name, we definitely see, the potential for Koosh to become over time a global brand. That's absolutely the ambition. So yeah, early days, but hopefully the sky's the limit.